Well, I must say that the enforcement mechanism was not disclosed to these panelists, so we don't know if there's a trap door or a buzzer or something, but we'll find out. If you set your clocks, if I go 8 minutes and 5 seconds, we'll find out. Well, my name is Peter Roskam, and I'm serving in my third term in the House of Representatives. I represent the western suburbs of Chicago, and I'm really pleased to be here as the co-chairman of the House Republican Israel Caucus. I thought what I would try to do is just give you a perspective over the past several months, what it's like to be inside the House of Representatives and dealing with these themes about the U.S. and Israeli relationship. I wouldn't presume to give the strategic talk or the weapons talk or the economic talk, but let me give you a talk, and that is some insight for what it's like to deal in the House of Representatives right now. Now, interesting thing, the 2010 election cycle was about what? It wasn't about Israel. It wasn't about foreign policy. It was about largely spending and economic themes and the role of the government in domestic life. That was the prelude to the 2010 election, and that was the national conversation that we had. So how is it that Israel has become front and center in House operations within the past several months? Well, it's largely based, I think, on the approach that the administration has chosen to take. And it's an interesting thing, because inside the House of Representatives, Israel has had an impact. Let me give you an example. You have 87 new Republicans that come into this Congress, many of whom have never served in public life, and their first requirement is to figure out how to fund the government through the end of the fiscal year. Turns out it's going to be a continuing task for them, but it was their first task too. So they come in, and there was a strong movement at the beginning to say, you know what, the best way to do this is let's just do across-the-board cuts and call it a day. It's the easiest thing. It's the most straightforward thing. Folks, you're not, quote, picking winners and losers. And then the more people began to understand the reality of that, the more they had, they came to the conclusion that they didn't want to do that. In large part, why was that? Because they knew it would have an adverse impact on the U.S.-Israeli relationship. They knew that it meant that they were going to cut military support to Israel. And I heard members of Congress tell me, nobody sent me here to cut support to Israel. Interesting little thing, but that was a decision that was a threshold decision inside the House strategy on moving forward. In other words, to do an across-the-board cut meant an adverse relationship or adverse support to Israel. Let's not go that route. Why? Because Israel is important to us. Israel needs our support, and let's come up with a different pathway. Another just little observation, and that is the decision by Speaker Boehner to invite Prime Minister Netanyahu for a joint session speech. Now, it needs no repeating here, but the imprimatur of a joint session speech, the amount of worldwide and national attention and focus on a joint session speech is something that money just can't buy, right? The ability to come in, to convene, and to speak to literally the who's who of American public life, there to be welcomed and to be celebrated, is a thing to behold. Now, this is an opportunity that was available to the previous speaker, and for whatever reason, she made a decision not to do that. I don't have any insight as to that thinking, but I do know that Speaker Boehner was intentional about inviting Prime Minister Netanyahu here. Now, that sort of focal point creates a great deal of energy around the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Another interesting thing, and it's just an anecdote, when I became chairman of the House Republican Israel Caucus, first thing I asked for, I said, well, where's the list of members? It's like, well, you got 5 members on your Israel Caucus. Really? Oh, that's helpful. That's really fabulous. In a place of 435 members, or you got 240 Republicans, I got 5 people on a list, and probably their staff just said yes. I said, we're gonna move the needle. I started just working the floor, just going up to members, and I'd say, hey, George, you want to be in the House Republican Israel Caucus? And they would say, well, I thought I was in the House Republican-Israel Caucus. And after I signed up 80 people, I gave up. It was like I wasn't playing fair. In other words, the esteem with which Israel is felt was something that was very easy to get people to get around. The purpose of the caucus then is to highlight the relationship, to advance the relationship, to educate folks about the relationship, but I almost felt like I wasn't playing fair. You know what I mean? Let me be OJ's lawyer, or give me a hard job here. Don't, you know, I'm advocating for Israel among people that basically feel great about Israel. I'm happy to do that, and it was an easy thing to do. The last thing that I think gives you an insight into how Israel is perceived is there was a large amount of new members who took the opportunity to accept an invitation to travel to Israel in August. I myself will be going on a 6th trip to Israel next month, and that it goes without saying, to see it is to believe it, and to come away from that experience is really formative. Just want to give you one last personal experience. I was involved in a competitive race for Congress in 2006, and it was one of those ones where you didn't know. I had no idea we were going to win or we were going to lose, one of those larger-than-life sort of situations. And during the fall, my wife and I decided, well, win or lose, let's go do something fun. You know, if you win, great, it's always fun. But if you lose, you want to have something to look forward to. And so we decided that we were going to go to Israel, and we hadn't been there as a family. And we have 4 children, and what I can only describe to you was a formative experience in Israel for my children. Now, I'm a Christian. I'm not going to Israel as a Jew. I'm going to Israel as a Christian with my wife and our 4 children, and it was something that is a touchstone in our family life, a touchstone experience in our family life. And I think that I'm here to bring encouragement today. An encouragement that says, within the House of Representatives, Israel enjoys a unique status, a status that's based on a premise of shared values, shared interests, in obviously a tumultuous part of the world. And it's one that I think most Americans, as they reflect back and they set all the politics aside, they recognize that a close relationship with Israel is in the best interest of the United States. It is in the best interest of the United States for Israel to be strong, for it to understand her relationship with the United States, and there not to be ambiguity about the relationship. And that's where I think the administration has in some ways run into difficulties. So, the sword of Damocles is upon me. I see the words time up. I'm moving back carefully. I'm not touching anything. And I'll be happy to stick around for questions.